You're listening to the Archaic Drum Podcast, in-depth conversations with great visionaries and free thinkers of today. Beat by beat, evolving self and society through ancient wisdom and emerging paradigms, with your host, James Benton.
Welcome back, everyone. Yes, it's true. I've returned to record at least a couple of more episodes for the Archaic Drum Podcast. In particular, I've felt it necessary to have a conversation with the guest I have with me here today. Jeffrey Wium's work, studies, and spiritual explorations have taken him around the world, providing first-hand experience with varying systems, ideologies, and perceptual realities. In 1995, after 10 years of intensive production schedules, location travel, and living in metropolitan centers, Jeffrey moved to quieter environs to nurture a path of inner study. After an in-depth study of Qigong in both the United States and China, he sought a deeper understanding in Tibet, Nepal, and India, and received the Avalokiteshvara initiation directly from the Dalai Lama during his time in these regions of the world. He is trained and worked with a variety of healing, transformative modalities which have included meditation, yoga, biogeometric design, wilderness living skills, and indigenous philosophy. Jeffrey began his education in Andean energy medicine in 2004 with academic programs and research expeditions as well as traditional apprenticeships in the Peruvian highlands. He has operated as a celestial Paqo since January 2007. Jeffrey offers talks, integrative programs, personal and professional consultations, and health-centered retreats based on conscious living principles, experiential learning, and non-duality. His astonishing film, titled Wisdomkeepers, Paqo Andino, he states was created as a way to allow others to experience ancient eco-spiritual ways of life, understand animistic consciousness, and help foster personal and collective well-being. Jeffrey Wium, welcome. How are you there today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Good. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to speak with me here today. I really do appreciate it. Jeffrey, could you begin by giving us a little view into how you arrived at where you are today? I'm aware you worked in photography, even here in France, I think, if I understand right, for a while, and some other places. And then you began to be aware of something wanting to pull you in a certain direction, if I'm not mistaken. Could you speak something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can go back to, coming into this life and always being a bit of a circle in a square hole, you might say, and never really feeling like all of myself could be seen or fit into a society where I grew up in Northern California. And so as I went out in the world, I was always looking for something, but I really wasn't able to find it externally. And as I went into a professional life, into photography and video and film and television, things like that, I always found myself in my off time sitting on the riverbank or up on a mountain or in a monastery or a temple. And I started to notice there was a deeper thing that was calling, but I didn't really have a way to bridge what seemed like two very different worlds. And as I went along around the mid-90s, I started to get a bit burnt out from working in those worlds and took some time off and went up into the redwood forests and sat under the trees for a good long while. And those trees and mountains and streams started talking to me, which was a great surprise. And it really started something new and unfamiliar. And, I ran out of money to just take time off, so I went back into the workplace. But once I went back, I couldn't really exist there without having that nature spirit around me. So I kind of left Los Angeles in the busy pace, went up to Northern California and then into Oregon, and then found myself studying Qigong and went over to China and to the Himalayas and worked with the Dalai Lama. And that really opened up a completely new realm. And I had some pretty strong mystical experiences in that period of time that really provided things that I couldn't understand and no one around me could understand. So I started to seek out those who might be able to enlighten me a little bit on what was going on in my life. And so that was really the genesis of it all.
Mm-hmm. You had an experience, I think, while you were in Nepal, when you were walking by a temple there. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, I was actually in Lhasa, and I was actually there with the group who were studying Qigong down in Beijing, and then again in Lhasa. We were on a free day after we'd finished our work, and we were going into a temple, and it was a large square temple. I walked around 3/4 of the way around it on the inside, and there was probably 100 monks and Rinpoches chanting in the middle, from the Lama, the high Rinpoche at one end down to the initiates at the other end. And I stood there kind of in a daze staring, and I was being transported into a kind of a different state of being. And all of a sudden my eyes focused on one of the monks right in front of me, and he lifted up his finger and started calling me over with his finger, like, come here. Mm-hmm. And I looked around me like, who, me? And he nodded, and he said, yeah, come here. So he had me climb over the barrier and walk out in the middle of this group of 100 monks. And he sat me down, and he put his robe on me and his big yellow hat, and he just motioned like, come on, start chanting. And to my surprise, I opened my mouth, and all these Tibetan prayers and chants came out, and I kind of suddenly was going into a past life that I had forgotten and hadn't remembered yet. And there I was having this reality check with all the other monks kind of laughing and smiling at me and welcoming me into the fold. And I would say from there, it really kind of went ballistic, and I found myself having some pretty wild mystical experiences after that.
Yeah, you would go out into the forest or something, and there would be things occurring all of a sudden. What was that all about?
Well, that was an early one, actually. Before I went to Tibet, that was one of the genesis moments that took me there. As I was riding my mountain bike through the forest in Eugene, Oregon, or actually on a street, and a voice said to me, "Go ahead and turn off your headlamp on your bike." And there was no lights out there, no moon, nothing. And I was kind of getting in this argument, if you will, with this inner voice saying this, but it was dangerous, And I said, I understand. Now turn off the lights, kind of shut up and let go.
Get on with it.
So I went down the road and then it said, well, go ahead and take your hands off the handlebars now too while you're at it. I resisted a bit until I finally went, all right. So I did, and I closed my eyes actually and took my hands off the handlebars and rode. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard this voice screaming, "Stop!" So I jammed on the brakes and flipped on the light, and I'd come to a T intersection. And I thought, okay, they got my back.
Incredible.
And so I took a left turn back into town, and riding along, next thing I know, all this light around me lit up, and I pulled off to the side of the road to let the car pass, but there was no car. And when I went into my mind space, I what's going on? I don't understand it. So I kept going a little bit further. 30 seconds, a minute later, it happened again.
Wow.
And then I looked around. I realized it was me that lit up. And so all the photons in my body lit up about 30, 40 feet in diameter around me. And that brought tears to my eyes. I really didn't know what was going on. And that was something where I went out to seek out the master Qigong practitioner, say what's going on. And she smiled and said, why don't you come to Tibet with me? And then when I got to Tibet, I had this experience that I just explained with the monks. And then I had a vision where I was to go to Dharamsala. And I had just done an initiation with the Dalai Lama just prior to that in Los Angeles. And so he came and said, come to Dharamsala, and I did. And so I went through Kathmandu to get my visa into India. And when I was there, I went to a place called the Monkey Temple. And when I was there, oh gosh, I had a big experience with about 100, 150 monkeys that came down and surrounded me and took me into the temple. And it just kind of went from there. And so this whole life had opened up for me where previously I had no contact with it. And all my life I had known there was something more to do, or something more than just, going to the store to satisfy your yearnings.
Yeah.
And at this point in the mid-'90s, it just really started opening up. And then by 2000, I actually injured myself while I was filming a TV series. And that accident, or that on purpose, was really the catalyst that took me into a full-time occupation with all this. Into the mystic, you might say.
Well, I can relate to that in the way of having feelings like this. I remember even when I was back in high school, it's like, what the hell am I doing here? And it just really caused some problems for me at the time. Parents took me to a psychotherapist, but I realized soon after that, sort of it was, I just needed to live my life more and not get caught up in things that, don't really nourish so well.
Yeah, I think society in general is facing that right now, where you have these major shifts in consciousness going on, and
absolutely,
people can't just do what they used to do anymore. And there's a lot of people wondering what's going on and need a lot of, I would say, facilitation or understanding on exactly what's happening to this stuff.
Yeah. So, your film, Wisdomkeepers, I've watched it twice now. It's just beautiful. I don't know what else to say about it. There's something special about this film for me. It was sort of like an unbroken prayer that touched something very deep inside. You stated that this project came to you in a vision while you were in Peru. Is that right?
It is, yeah. I was doing a pilgrimage, leading a group up there. We do retreats every year in the Andes and take people up into these kind of environments where animistic consciousness is alive and well, and you speak to the elements, you speak to the angels and all that. And so I was walking along, and I just got this whole vision of making this film. And I had stopped and told Adolfo, who's my colleague there, and it's the main Paqo in the film. I explained what I'd seen, and he smiled at me and he said, I had the same vision a few months ago. I was just waiting for somebody to show up that had the technical background to do this thing. And so we kind of smiled and cried with each other and said, okay, well, if this is to be, let it be. And so I went back home and I called up a friend and explained to him, and I had met him on another project, and he was part of the funding organization for that project. And so I explained what I'd seen and what Adolfo had seen, and he just said, well, I'll send you a check, you go make it. And I had that moment of, uh-oh. And I had walked away from that career 7 years prior because I wasn't finding the content or the depth to what I was looking for. And conscious media was not happening in the mid-'90s. And
no, it wasn't.
So I was very pleased and a little bit kind of like, okay, I got to get things together, and that started process in 2008, and the film unfolded over the course of the next couple of years, and by 2013 we had it done, and we were out traveling the world and screening it, and it is an unbroken prayer. It's a transmission that comes from a lineage, one of the few unbroken lineages in this world, and the information has been held and stewarded for over 10,000 years to this time, where people started to wake up and start to look at truth being more valuable than power.
Yeah.
And I'm very pleased that I could play my part in the fulfillment of that and put a life, 20 years of working in media together with my, at that time, fledgling kind of career as a mystic. And it was a real full circle and a combining everything that I'd been looking for before. So I think for me personally, it was, when anybody takes a road less traveled and moves away from a career where you're established and goes into the unknown, there's a lot of uncertainty that ensues, and people sometimes think you're crazy. And so to have that come together like that was a real confirmation of taking that course.
So you said that both Paqo Andino and yourself had a vision around creating this film. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did. The original vision was for this film, but it was a series of films where the wisdom that has been held by several of the indigenous tribes come forward. And right now I'm working with the Ainu in Hokkaido, Japan.
Mm-hmm.
There's only 2 of the full-blooded Ainu left, and we're discussing whether we're going to make another film to convey that. So
great.
It's part of the discussion is film the best format, one being that it can reach many people, but the time it takes to make a film like that might be better served in sitting with people and actually taking them through the process of awakening itself. So both has its benefits. We're just seeing if that's really to be. And also the Ainu have not really revealed their wisdom to anybody, let alone the Japanese who have been persecuting them. So one of the things that allowed this film in the Andes to take place is that I'd been called into the lineage and initiated in 2007. And the overlighting benefactors, the spirits that guide us in that lineage, had said specifically, you have to do this by yourself because it has to maintain the resonance of the prayers and the transmission. And so being that you're a Paqo and a colleague of these and known them for years, we can able to maintain a certain frequency and make it an offering from the tradition as opposed to more of an anthropological view from the outside looking in.
I remember in the film, during one of the prayers that Paqo Andino was offering, he spoke of the 4 quadrants of creation. What are these quadrants, Jeffrey, and some of the teachings that come out of them?
You could relate quadrants as levels in one aspect. They're all interrelated. The main teachings of the lineage, and so when you begin as a Pampa Messiah or one who deals with the earth realms and, in stewardship of Pachamama before you move up into the celestial and work with life force energy, which is Kauzai, which is their equivalent to Chi or Prana. You work with what they call the Yonkai, and that is what in the West we would look at as a combination of the 2nd and 3rd chakras, or creativity, fertility, being a feminine married with the will, or the masculine aspect of doing. And that is a wisdom center in itself and a life force in itself. And the secondary companion to that would be Munai, which is known as love, and that's in the heart center of the 4th chakra. And then you have Yachai, which is a combination or a marriage of intuitive intelligence and experiential knowledge. And so when you bring those together, you have a wisdom center that is centered in the pineal gland, one in the heart, and one just around the navel. And then the 4th quadrant is Kauzai, or life force itself. And life force being everything which is our sexuality, which is everything that animates us. And so as that comes into the world, it moves beyond the sexuality into how one writes a book, how one mows the lawn, how one cleans their house, how you have a conversation, how you make a meal, how you drive your car. The life force that expresses itself through all those actions is vital, and it's not so much what you do, but how you do it. And then you use the intelligence of the creative fertility and the will, the love, the intuitive and the intellectual, and you create a totality of intelligence. And all of that is based on heart intelligence. So you have the Yachai, or the intelligence of the mind and the intuition, sitting and balancing with the creative fertility. In other words, the mother and the father balancing the place of the heart and innocence of the holy child, if you will. And life force, the 4th quadrant, feeding all of that. So what it does is it brings you through a state of awareness and kind of an alchemical process where you start to look at the areas where we're blocked, where we're incomplete in our lives, and then to not run from them or try to push them away and ignore them, but to actually do the alchemical process to bring them to life, to turn lead into gold, if you will. And the teachings are very profound and very deep, and I think have a very great, they're a very great aid in the process of self-realization. So it's not so much following a teacher as it is finding the light inside yourself and then becoming that loving presence yourself. And to me, that's exactly what others like Gandhi were talking about, to be the example you'd like to see in the world. You know,
as in the kingdom of God is within, huh?
You got it. Yeah, so it's, these principles and practices are timeless.
Yeah.
And it's something that has been forgotten by the West. And because it's forgotten in the West, we tend to have holes or gaps in our consciousness. And what's beautiful about the ancient ways and the animistic ways, the ones that are close to Earth, is that they come together and they fill in the gaps. And so when you fill in those gaps, you have a completion. And as I was mentioning before, for example, you're no longer avoiding what bothers you. You're actually looking at the opportunity and recognizing that in 3D here, in this reality, in order to create fire, you need friction. In order to have realization, you need to have incomplete aspects. So you bring the complete from the incomplete. You find the comfort within the discomfort. You own everything in responsibility. In Hawaii, where I live, we have the teachings there are about ho'oponopono, and that is a complete responsibility for all aspects, both within and without.
Yeah.
And when you come to that realization, you no longer are in conflict. You're no longer in duality. You're no longer in separation. You're no longer in competition. And, all of these teachings are really based on a universal understanding that came to this planet a very long time ago and have been held by these traditions as we went through the fall of man 13,000 years ago. And at this time, society is waking up to the fact that certain things don't work anymore. And we have very interesting things going on, for example, in the United States with the elections there.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden you have those that were in power or kind of the liberal-minded going to war against the conservative.
Yeah.
And so it's quite ironic that you have one going against the other. And what I see beautiful about it, this is that the step beyond that is we're all going to finally get together and say, okay, we've had enough. And what should we do today? And so it's not so much looking at the short term as it is looking at the long term. And for a lineage that's over 10,000 years old, they're very much about the long term.
Speaking of all of this occurring now, do you think that it might be more the details of what's happened are it's less about that, but more of a wider occurrence of just a dissolution of what's arisen in Western society?
Very much so. You have competing mindsets. You have one that is to control the people and the other one is to liberate the people. And in order to own one's own sovereignty and authenticity and authority, we have to move beyond kind of the temper tantrums that we're experiencing now. In other words, we're kind of orbiting the threshold, if you will, and we're looking at the temporary and we're fighting against that. And what we're really fighting against is the eternal part of ourselves. So once we surrender into loving presence, then we move through the threshold and go into that eternal aspect and that divinity that's always been inside and contained there. And I think people are now just waking up to the fact that they've been hoodwinked. They've lived in a very diminished state of being and consciousness. And, there may be some more fireworks temporarily, and people taking sides, just like you go to a professional sports arena and you take a side who you want to win. But my invitation is let's move beyond all that and step out of these arenas and all these gladiator matches and come back and love each other, huh?
Yeah, I think it's time for the competition to come to a close.
Amen.
I'm aware that you've spent some time with Native American elders in North America and are familiar with some of those teachings. How does what's happening right now at Standing Rock in North Dakota, how does it fit in with the bigger vision of what's emerging right now, you think?
Well, you're starting to see how the tribal peoples of the world, really, but in North America, have been decimated or separated, have gone into anger, because they were poorly treated. So you have the nations coming together for the first time and standing together in over 100 years. So that alone is a significant move. That is going to call consciousness to all the people of all different creeds and colors to stand together, whether you're Democrat or Republican or male or female, transgender, it doesn't matter. What they're doing is they're showing a solidarity, and they're also revealing in that when you stand together in that solidarity, it reveals and shines light on the agenda and the people. So one of the hypocrisies up there in the pipeline is that the town of Bismarck relocated the pipeline down through the reservation because they didn't want it to contaminate their drinking water. And here the native people are standing up saying, we don't want it to contaminate our drinking water either. So let's reroute it again. So at some point, something's going to have to give. And it makes me think of Gandhi when he was outraged at the British taxing salt, in a hot country where people needed salt to maintain their equilibrium. So he made a long walk down to the seashore and said, can't tax this. So eventually, through that standing up in solidarity in the heart space, everything else comes to fall away. And it may take a week, it may take a month, it may longer, but it's a very powerful movement, and one that is not going to be overcome or placated or pushed down, because more and more people are coming together, not just for the pipeline, but for humanity in general.
Well, as the Greek root definition of the word apocalypse comes to mind, the veil does, in fact, seem to be lifting today. And this just sort of prayerful presence that you're seeing, in North Dakota seems to be bringing to light a lot of the things that need to go through some sort of transformation at this time.
You got it. Well, I think it's bringing us back to we the people, and it makes me think of after the shootings in Paris, the Muslim men that blindfolded themselves and stood out on the street corner and said, I'm not one of them. And the Parisians stepped up and hugged them, and it became a sensation. So people are starting to be able to see beyond the charade and beyond this disempowered, situation state. And really, people are coming together and saying, well, we're a lot more powerful than stand together.
Yeah. Jeffrey, you mentioned before how both Native American and Amazonian shamans or teachers had assisted you in finding what you called a reference point, excuse me, for your life when there was still some confusion, I'm guessing, in regards to what you were moving through at the time.
Yeah.
What was going on for you at this time?
Well, I was in my mind, and I was trapped there. So the structures that, even though I was, alternative or rebellious in my teens and things like that, there was still very much the unconscious program, or let's call it a processor, like in a computer. So you have raw data that comes in through your life and your perceptual realities, and it all filters through this processor, if you will, and spits out certain things. And one of the interesting things is close friends of mine that have high degrees in education, they have very strong processors in their computers. And so for them to move outside of those protocols is even more difficult. So for me at that time, I was looking at how do I get to the raw data that's coming in, whether that be channeling or intuition or knowledge or what have you, before it hits the processor. And I didn't even know there was a processor. So I went into these places, and as I was mentioning earlier on in our conversation, that I started having these mystical experiences that were way outside of the parameters of what the processor could understand and that Western mindset. So it started to open up, and I went out into the jungles, and I worked deeply in techniques and protocols to help me put reality as I know it on an even footing with all different aspects of reality. And when that happened, it took the processor and threw it into it just kind of blew it out of the water. And what happened is you wind up having multiple streams of information coming in all at once, and then you set about the process of trying to figure out how to understand and work with all of that. So I think the first thing, to answer your question, I went out there and I had to do some demolition to the old structure, and then sit in that space, and I had to learn how to die. I had to learn how to die to my fears. I had to learn how to die to my concerns or my responsibilities. Even in making that film, I approached it as a director, from being trained as a director, and I quickly learned that I had to learn how not to direct, because I was getting in the way of allowing what wanted to be to work through me, as opposed to me processing it and converting it. And I would say that to look at the structures of our mind, and especially the pathologies of our mind, those incomplete aspects and understandings that have entrapped us in separation and fear. We've grown as a people to be fearful of one another. And now it's a time to learn how to take that and use it to come back together, to come into the emotional intimacy, to come into the healing, to come into the loving space, to understand and to heal the dynamics between the masculine and the feminine, both inside of ourselves and outside of ourselves. And so that stage, and that was in the mid-2000s, was a very, very valuable step that kind of freed up space so I could understand things.
Yeah, this is one of our root teachings, huh? You spoke of your need to get out of the way of the filmmaking process. And we can apply that in so many areas of our lives, I think, huh?
Yeah.
I'm aware that you have some relation. I know you grew up, if I'm not mistaken, not too far from there, in relation to Mount Shasta in Northern California. And I see that you'll be holding a retreat there next year. I've made only two trips to this mountain. I lived in Northern California as well for a period, the early 90s. The first one was with my father. And the second time I was there, I was with my mother. And while I was there with her, while she was lying in her bed where we stayed, she had a rather stark experience or vision of which the contents of I'm not able to really recall at the moment. Could you give us sort of a brief history of this mountain in relation to the indigenous cultures there, and what, if anything, do you think this place has to reveal to us?
Well, it is a very powerful place. It's one of the primary holy mountains in the world. And its original name is Wium. And what's interesting about that, Wium. Puyok. And what's interesting is down in South America, you have that
I didn't know this.
This yoke at the end, Ultimasai yoke.
Oh, yeah,
and
they bind together.
One who embodies. And so this mountain, Wium Puyok, is one who embodies the energies of creation. And so it's kind of one of the, if not the top holy mountains in the world, on par with Kailash and Olympus and some others. And to me, it's an active portal that you can just go right into and plug right in and go anywhere and do anything. I've been living there for the last year, right on the foot of the mountain, and do retreats there, as you mentioned. And it has been a holy place for the Native Americans for tens of thousands of years. It has a vortexual quality where you step into this morphogenic field that's there, and everything starts to move. And it really just it brings it up, and it's a powerful place to do your work, to plug in. There's a lot of extraterrestrial life that moves through the place. There's a lot of ascended masters that are there. It's part of a grid of holy mountains all over the world that I work with. And it's just, there's something very special about it.
You responded to a message I sent to you not so long ago in regards to some personal experiences I've had here. And you stated that the very fiber of our bodies, you said, has come into completion and the world has shifted into a healed state.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a bit more about this here?
Yeah, that really gets right down into our biology and our chromosomes. So you have the X and the Y chromosome, the X being the XX of female and the XY of male. The XX is the one that receives and holds the cosmic womb, and the XY is the action or the lightning that impregnates the ground, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And up until very recently, in August of this year, humankind had been interrelating based on the incomplete chromosome. So in other words, at the moment of conception, the soul comes and encounters the incomplete part of the mother and the incomplete part of the father, and therefore goes to war, goes into duality, and goes into a suffering, if you will, because they're always in that complete state of where one comes from before Earth. You come in and you can't figure out why we're operating the way we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so the war begins and the veil of consciousness drops. And so I may be having a relationship with a woman, and I'm dealing with the incomplete aspect of her XX chromosome that she inherited from the incomplete aspect of her mother, father, and lineages before her, and vice versa, her to me or me to a man, her to another woman, for example. And so what you have is you have the background music, to use a metaphor, is one of incomplete. So you're dancing an incomplete dance until there's sufficient realization to bring you into the understanding of, aha, look at what this is. So that's a very difficult, very long, drawn-out process. And so in August of this year, a group of mystics, including myself, came together, and we actually did the work in the Cedars of God in Lebanon, up in the middle of the war zone, of all places. You know, tanks and automatic rifles and warplanes very close at hand. And we sat in that grove of 5,000-year-old trees, and the trees agreed to hold it and bring it down, that transmission down into the roots and impregnate the earth. And we called it forward, and that the XY and the XX, or simplify that, the X and the Y chromosome came into completion for the first time. So what that means is that inside of each being, in each human, we now vibrate in the resonance and the frequency, resonance being the background energetic that holds everything, the cosmic womb, the frequency being the transmission that comes through. And that when you have resonance and frequency together, it creates energy. And so now the energy of creation is based on a complete aspect as opposed to an incomplete aspect. And you can just imagine the difference, how that comes to be and what that shines upon all of us here. So we're still kind of might be polluted in our mindset with the pathologies that we picked up from our personal experience. But the energetic that we're drawing from in order to heal from, in order to come to resolution with, comes from a complete understanding as opposed to an incomplete understanding. That is a fundamental quantum shift in understanding for the human race. And you can relate that August of 2016 timeframe with the prophecies of the ancient races, which said the end of time is August of 2016. You know, I didn't recognize that till a couple months later. I had an aha moment where I was like, oh, look what that means. So the end of time is the end of the incomplete era, or the falling asleep, the fall of man. And so we have an awakening that we're talking about is now influencing the Standing Rock. It's influencing elections. It's influencing every decision and every thought form we have. And so we have really come to a place where humanity is awakening. And in the Andes, they have the prophecy, there'll be those of the north that find the light from the darkness of their time. And this is what we're talking about. And this is why the film is out. This is why the transmissions and the teachings are coming down out of the mountains to the South Americans. They see the glacial melts as the glaciers are the storehouse of wisdom, and they have to melt in order for those waters to come down and come in our bodies and influence our cells. And so it's a complete resolution or evolution of consciousness that's well underway, and everything that stands opposed to that is just falling down because it doesn't have, all of that is based on incomplete, and they prey on the incomplete, and they draw their energy from the incomplete, the dark side, if you will, the absence of love, the void. And so now what we have is we have a people that are complete, that are understanding that it's all about love. They're starting to hear and understand what people like John Lennon were speaking about long ago, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Jesus, Buddha, Lao Tzu, you name it. It's all the same.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by the actual fiber of our being has shifted.
Wow.
It's profound what's happening now.
Incredible.
I'm glad to be alive at this time to actually witness and
it certainly is.
And bear this, because it's for as dark as it gets, there's equal intensity of the light.
Right.
And so in our consciousness and our free will within this realm, then one looks at, where do I focus my attention?
Mm-hmm.
Do I focus on what's wrong? Or do I recognize the opportunity of where I can bring my love and help it to make it right? And operate outside of this concept of right and wrong, which is Rumi saying, out beyond wrong and right, there's a field, I'll meet you there.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, we certainly left the trail at some point, many of our cultures today. And as we've spoken about here, we're openly witnessing the dissolution of particular constructs around the world.
Yeah.
I heard you speak once about something you called the violence of separation.
Yeah.
And I know you just touched on that, but is there anything else you would like to say about that?
Well, the state of separation, the idea that I'm me and you're you, because really there is no other and there's nothing beyond the within, is the most violent state that the human being can occupy, because in that state, you're always in a state of protection and competition. You're in a state of warfare. So you're always protecting against what hasn't even happened yet. Yeah. And that's a function of the primary mind, the fight or flight mechanism that's trying to keep you safe based on what happened before. But if you're going into the unknown, how can you possibly do anything new if you're only listening to what has happened before, which is about the incomplete, which is about the suffrage? And so in that violence, we create a vicious cycle that produces more violence. So in this coming together, in this completion, we come into a state of understanding that together, whether we're at Standing Rock or we're walking down the streets of a large city, we're much more powerful. But in that, understand that there's also forces at play that are supporting separation. Even after the elections in the United States, you had professional organizers, and paying people to go out and protest to stay in separation. So people, I think, would do well to understand that separation and fighting against is not the answer. To come together outside the violence, to set down the weapon of the mind.
Yeah. And
sit around the table and listen about serving all people in all ways. There's a great awakening that is happening, and it's not to look at the short term, but look at the long term.
Mm-hmm. Some years ago, I set myself out on sort of a mission to try and find any connections that may exist between Zen Buddhism and what I'll call indigenous shamanic cultures.
Mm.
For the most part, I just came to the conclusion that both of them presents different versions of teaching that fundamentally says, just watch, stop, and shut up. And that was kind of the only thing I could pull together that had some resemblance. But yet I see that as a very deep, if we say esoteric, fundamental teaching that comes out of these traditions. Was there ever a time in your life where you were like confused or had some confusion around? Because I know you have some connection, I don't know to what extent, but to Buddhism as well. Was there ever a conflict for you?
Every day. Absolutely. Are you kidding? There's that part of the mind that says, I have to do something about it. And the other part of the mind that says, blessed be.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized when I looked down, one foot is one and the other foot's the other, and if I'm going to walk, it's a lot easier to use both of them at the appropriate time than to jump along on one leg or the other, and that's just another form of separation and violence. And
Yeah.
you know, it's a place where we don't go into opposition, and then in our realization of what is being asked of us, we can use the skill sets at our disposal to take action or to come into loving presence with it. You know, and that's something that I'm in deep study with right now is, you know, do I sit back and accept all and allow and harm none? A very Buddhist tenet. And or do I, you know, step up and speak when necessary? So I think it's both. And I think it's up to the individual to understand that when it's appropriate and when it's not, and make sure you're not working from a place of inflicting more violence on anybody else. You know, there's a real spiritual arrogance that we can suffer from, where we think we have an idea and we're above something, and or we know what's best for another person, which is condemnation of another person's unfolding, because everything's an unfoldment of God, whatever God means to you. And so it's something that I sit with every day, and I just hope to trust my instincts and my insights and show up appropriately. And I obviously know pretty quick if it doesn't work, and you know, it's an ongoing process.
Continuous discernment and wise action that comes from deeper, I think. Yeah, I've same here. You know, I've went through a period of massive posting, you know, in relation to what's happening in North Dakota right now, and I've disconnected myself a lot from Facebook now the last several days and stayed quiet on it. So it seems right at this point.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind, if I can say, is that, you know, it's how we post as opposed to what we post. And it is important what we post. It's, instead of calling to the conflict and adding to the separation, it's really offering the meta position so that the highest aspect of each side of any conflict can come together in a new construct, and, you know, in conscious collaboration, and, you know, really move beyond the political agendas and the monetary agendas and things like that. And, you know, I mean, the simple thing with the pipeline is, why don't we just get on with free energy and forget this whole oil-based economy, shall we?
Yeah,
you know,
please.
And that's a meta position. And in the meantime, focus on the loving presence instead of the violence of what's going on. And, you know, there's always going to be paid instigators that go behind the scenes in any rally and make it worse so that the people can crack down. You know, it's the Hegelian dialectic, where if you have an agenda, create a problem so you can implement your solution. It goes back to Greek times, and that's live and well. And, you know, people like George Soros paying protesters to protest against Trump is just the same thing, a different version. And it's what we need to do is wake up to this space of how we can engage without our weapons. You know, and I think ultimately, through all of this violence, we are going to get tired of it. And, you know, even incarnationally, come in as the perpetrator, come in as what we call the victim. And at some point, you're going to understand both sides of the argument. You're going to say, enough, let's go somewhere else. And, you know, if you start talking interdimensionally, beyond the 12 dimensions in the lower realms, when we get up into the middle and the upper realms in the universes, or in the omniverse, you don't even have free will, because all there is love, and there's no need for free will. Free will is just a construct of duality, so that you have the opportunity to choose the light versus the dark. But once you have risen or ascended or enlightened to a state beyond that, there's nothing but love. And this is the thing that fuels the universe. So it's just part of the temporary temper tantrum that we're experiencing here. But again, that's the friction that rubs together that creates the fire, which causes the illumination. So blessed be, you know, and for whoever wants to do whatever they want to do long enough until they decide not to do it anymore, blessed be, I'm not going to stand in their way. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not going to stand in their way if they're wielding some axe,
Yeah.
But I'm definitely gonna stand somewhere and do my part and hold presence and say, look, we both have the same colored blood running through our system. Look, the stars are above both of us. And I think that's what the holy people throughout time have been trying to say. And I think now, because we do have that complete aspect of our chromosomes at play, we're much more able to adhere to new ways of being instead of living in the fear of the incomplete.
Wonderfully said. We've got a few minutes left here. Could you tell us a bit about your project? It's called the Islands of Light Collective.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is this about?
It's about people who have been dedicating their life to consciousness and who have businesses, retreat centers, books, you name it. And just ways of being, the way they fold their clothes. It's a format where people can come together and bring consciousness and bring ideas to themselves and others. So it may just be a tea party or an evening gathering. It could be a complete retreat center. A network of retreat centers is actually what it is. And it's places that we call it find and found. The find is you're finding people who have already established networks and centers, and then adding these quantum understandings to it and bringing this programming, this education in so that children are educated cosmically, interdimensionally, consciously, and not just down in the lower principles of education. And the found is founding new places or sanctuaries where this can happen. And my partner and I have set out, and we started that in May of this year in Mount Fuji, and set what we call a beacon of light, or a point, a connection for this. And this will go out around the world. And we're sitting with all types of things that can come together. So, for example, in a couple of weeks, we'll be giving a talk on conscious communication and conscious media to a advertising agency in Finland, so that we can start looking at how we advertise instead of looking at how we manipulate based on wanton ideas. We start to bring in consciousness and inspiration into that idea. So it's really taking consciousness into the boardroom, into the classroom, into the government bodies, and restructuring all the organizations so that we can come to a new way of being, in which, interestingly enough, is the prophecies of the ancient traditions, where this Panchakuti, this time where between eras where everything falls apart, which we're seeing every day, in the banking system, in the government system, it's opening up a space where we can all come together and say, what shall we do today? And so the islands of light are the individuated spaces or the hubs of the networks, where light or love can be held present and weave amongst all the other hubs. There's organizations like Impact Hub that are in 40 or so major metropolitan centers around the world. And those formats are brought for people to come together and to work collaboratively for social engineering, things like that. And so you add the cognitive aspect to that, the consciousness to that, and that organization then expands out in the same way that an advertising agency can, or a political body, or an education system. So the Islands of Light Collective is a format for people to come together and to work in those ways. And it's in its birthing process right now.
Beautiful. You have what looks like a fairly full schedule coming up, including something you offer called Awakening Retreats that you'll be holding in Peru, Hawaii. You're going back to Lebanon, which I am really looking at this point of finding some way to be there with you, and other places too. Could you tell us a little bit about what takes place at these retreats? I know you can't give a full immersion of what occurs there, but
Sure. Well, it's for me, the experiential education, one finding their own light through their own personal process, is paramount to awakening. It's no longer the time of the teacher, the guru, where you sit and you follow and you mimic what they do. That era has passed. That held its place, but once we moved into the larger cycle of light, where we entered in early 2013, we're in a time where every single thing has the potential to trigger enlightenment. Whereas prior to that time, it was very specific mantras, it was very specific functions and things like that, initiations that could help open it. Now you can wake up by turning on your car. It doesn't matter. It's all in cahoots to bring us to awaken. So what we did is, about 10 years ago, we started to bring people down to the Andes and give them the experience, for example, what they see happening in the film. And it's a very personal, very profound experiential process of going into a way of being that is based on animistic consciousness, to have encounters with beings that manifest in front of you, what we call angels, to work in the ways of animistic consciousness, to work with the elements very directly, to be in a landscape that's alive and well, that is very much, the heart is very much beating. Mm-hmm. And that has then spread out to include Japan and Hawaii and Asia and the Middle East, and we'll go to Africa and Australia and places like that as well. Those are all in the works. But what we do is both 1 and 2 day programs to convey the information and do the transmissions and meditations and give some real practical techniques and get a real solid, traction, tire to the pavement, so to speak. And then to do these 7 to 10 to 14 day retreats where you can really go deep and really be immersed in that type of work and get some work done. And I find it's one of the most efficient ways I've found to wake up and to get past the blockages. Mm-hmm. So that's why we offer them, and we work with indigenous maestros in all the various places, and even the Ainu, as we're working up to in May to offer a retreat there, and it'll be the first time the Ainu have ever revealed their medicine to anybody. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great honor to build these bridges and honor these people, these wisdom keepers that have held it for so long. Yeah. And now it's the time they're ready to pass it along to their younger brothers and sisters, as they call us.
Yeah, needed now more than ever.
Yeah. And it's these traditions that have never been broken that are important, because a lot of traditions are missing pieces of the puzzle, and some are left very angry. If we look at some of the Native American tribes, and I don't mean to single them out, but there's still a lot of anger that can happen there. And in the Andes, for example, it's a sacred feminine based mystery school, if you will. And they don't even have the word to have in their language. There's no possession. There's no competition. There's no animosity. There's no separation. There just is. And it's akin to sitting with a grand old sequoia tree. And for me as a male, for me to learn how to sit in the strength of softness was very much supported by my work in the Andes. And each tradition contains information that is both their own and part of the collective. So together it's a larger whole that we're coming to understand. And as I'd mentioned, it's kind of like the gaps in modern society are filled by the wisdom, the heart wisdom, or the heart forms, as I call it, of ancient ways.
Did I read on your website where you'll be offering some teachings, transmissions, etc., online as well at some point?
Yeah, one of the things that we've come to understand in these last years is jet lag and exhaustion from traveling around plays a part. So it's much more efficient and much more beneficial to transmit over the web. Mm-hmm. So people can participate not only in the programs, but in the ceremonies. So, for example, when we were working with Mount Fuji in May, we had, over 100 sync-up groups around the world that were holding space at the exact same time. So now we add a cellular connection to that, so it becomes literally a neural network of awakening happening. And there's a new camera out that we got called a Mevo that hooks up to live stream, and it transmits right out over the 4G network from anywhere in the world, and people can just tune in their computer and participate. And so look at technology showing up as a means for awakening, huh?
Absolutely. I think it has its important purpose in what's happening right now.
And it also provides a means where there's an archive of the material as well. So, for example, this weekend we're doing a 2-day program here in London, and we'll record that and then make it available on the website.
Wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to that. Your website is wisdomkeepersproject.org, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. I'll write that in the show notes as well. Jeffrey, to finish up here, what is the most important thing, we could say, I suppose, necessary that one can do at this time to help move this transition along as we see it unfolding?
Wow, that's a simple one. That's take responsibility for one's own perspective. That plays into the principles of Ho'oponopono, the Hawaiian work. And it's to realize that one has called everything into their life. They've made left and right turns and everything to be there at every exact time. And it's way too easy to say, it's not my responsibility. But your perspective is key, because one man's trash is another man's treasure, so to speak. So one can look at something as an entanglement or a difficulty and move away from it and miss the opportunity for grace. Or one can say, look at this, look at me. How can I own this and say that I've called this forward, so that the person that's screaming at me, for example, I cannot react against that, but I can say, look what they're doing. They're calling out for love in a very violent way. And so if I can become love and be a loving presence for them, let that temper tantrum. Let that be a balm. And that alone will change the world. So, there's sayings out there that say, if you want to change the world, change your heart. Yeah. That's really what I'm speaking to, is that type of impeccable responsibility to love and to step away from feeding the flames of violence and separation, and just sit in the vulnerability, the strength of the vulnerability, and the space of not knowing. Because if we just rely on what we know, we're limiting ourselves. It's where we go into the unknown where we discover new things and new ways to go about things. It's what Steve Jobs said. He said, think different. He's getting to that point exactly. It's having the courage to swim a different way, or to, it's Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It's that book. It's all those things. Lots of references. Yeah.
Jeffrey Wium, thank you so much for speaking with me here today.
Thank you for all the work you do in the program and all the light you shine. It takes all of us,
Yeah, it does. Well, I wish you well, and I'm sure we'll be crossing paths at some point again.
Mm-hmm.
Have a great day there, Jeffrey.
All right. Aloha.
Aloha. If you'd be interested in viewing Jeffrey's film, Wisdomkeepers, Paqo Andino, you can do that through his website at wisdomkeepersproject.org, and it can be viewed as well at Gaia.com. And thank you for joining me here on the Archaic Drum Podcast.